So this is the toolkit we now have. This is what it's actually going to look like. Key headings there, where they've stripped it down from initially there were 10. And now we've got 7 and early years where appropriate to a school. Basically by putting some of them together. And the way I've structured these 3 days is today to look at this introduction and meaning for the school, and we'll look at inclusion and safeguarding. And then on day 2, curriculum and teaching, achievement, attendance, and day 3, personal development, well-being, early years, leadership and governance. That's how I've structured this course. They're the key headings. So this is where I was saying, have a think about, and there's a format I've put together in one of the sections for you to think about who in your school, in your team, would be front and centre for each of these headings. If Ofsted want to talk with someone about attendance and behaviour, who do they need to speak to? Rather than just one person on the spot. All that work we've done around deep dives and developing our subject leaders, of course, they won't be spoken to in isolation anymore, like they were in deep dives, but Ofsted still want to look at the development of subject leadership. So the model that's been used on a lot of the pilots has been joint learning walks, as I described, with senior leaders in the morning, in the afternoon, extended learning walks, and then asking to meet with the subject leader, the teachers with their subject leadership hats on at the end of the day. In a small school, in one group, where an awareness should be in place that people will be wearing more than one subject leadership hat in a small primary school, or in an average or larger than average primary school, perhaps splitting those subject leaders into 2 groups. The lead inspector meets with, the STEM subject leaders and PE, and the other team inspector meets with the English lead, geography, the humanities leads, the art lead, etc. But meeting with them collectively, talking with them in general terms about the impact they've had as subject leaders, the training they've had, so they've undertaken any monitoring, maybe asking each of them to give it a suggestion of what are their development points this year, something impact they've had. But also talking to them about things they've seen during the day. So it might be an inspector says, I saw 2 PE lessons this afternoon with the deputy head. Can I just ask who's the PE lead, please? Or can I just ask you, I saw this in the dance lesson. Can I just ask about that? Or what does it look like in terms of one of those PE lessons was led by an external provider. How does that work with how to ensure that they have an impact on staff development as well as covering PPA? So they could, by the time they come to that meeting with the subject leaders, as an inspector, you've got some questions that you want to unpick with them, both collectively about their collective development as middle leaders, what their monitoring looks like, but also they will have some subject-specific questions that they would want to pick up with those people. Now, as a head, behind the scenes, and as an SLT, you could well know that they're bound to want to ask the PE lead about that later on. So let's be honest, behind the scenes, you're going to be saying, when you go in that meeting, just be ready because they saw something in the lesson that they asked about. They're probably going to ask you about that as well. You can manage that. But that looks like that's what the model's going to be around subject leadership. They're not dropping it completely. It's because of Ofsted that we put all that work into our subject leaders and deep dives and got them to a certain level and have all those systems in place and all that training. So it's going to be a collective model now, basically. I'll look at that again when we look at leadership and governance on the 3rd day. 5-point graded scale. Ofsted say high expectations. So this is developed from the language they had before. One of the second one was attention needed. They have changed that from the draft attention needed to the brand new needs attention. And Sir Martin Oliver has said in a recent speech, schools should not try and draw, make comparison between these grades and good or outstanding. And yet Ofsted have said that schools that are currently good or outstanding can keep that on their website, on their banner outside the school until they are re-inspected. So that just confuses parents. This idea that this is all for parents, that's going to be very confusing for parents if Ofsted are saying there is no correlation between these grades and the grades that everyone is familiar with, RI, good and outstanding. So as Martin Oliver said last week, that they're totally different. They don't correlate at all. I don't know, but that's what he says. Because expected standard doesn't sound particularly positive. It sounds very, what it says, isn't it? It sounds very average. But yet when you read the descriptors, expected standard is challenging. But anyway, that's what we have now. And rather than having all 5 of them on one sheet in the toolkit, Ofsted have gone for the 3, and then the 2 outliers sit beneath. And they have told all inspectors to come into school, any school, with the premise that everything is expected standard, and then you work either side of that. Now, I'm not sure about mindset for inspectors here, because any of us, if we were visiting a school that was currently special measures, worst case scenario, or has had 2 consecutive requires improvement judgments from Ofsted. We've looked at their IDSR, we're going in November, their IDSR has been published. There's a lot of data that's significantly low. There are attendance issues. There's been high staff turnover. There's a deputy head who's standing in as acting head at the moment, but was an inexperienced deputy. Are we really going to go into that school with the mindset, well, let's start with, it's going to be expected standard, let's prove it otherwise, compared with a school that's had 2 consecutive outstanding judgments as data set that is to die for, etc., etc. But technically, Ofsted come in with the premise for every area of the toolkit. They start with the premise the school is at expected standard. But it's a tough bar to meet, because inclusion, in this case, I've used the inclusion as the example here, meets the expected standard when all the following apply. It is no longer a best fit judgment. Under previous frameworks for good, it's been best fit. And then under the last framework, to get outstanding, you had to have all the good and then the icing on the cake with the outstanding. That was all or nothing. But just bear in mind that that key phrase is all the following apply. And then when you look at strong standard, you've met the expected, and it's not just best fit, you've got some of the others as well. It says all the following apply. So that's got huge implications for self-evaluation, for example. But because Ofsted are saying to inspectors, begin on the premise that every school is expected standard, that's why in each of the toolkit sections, the expected standard has the most text. And they have actually cut back on what they had in the draft toolkits, because in the draft toolkits, it was a bit wishy-washy. There wasn't too much difference between expected and strong. The other thing that's changed is now the 2 outliers, the urgent improvement, the worst category, and the exceptional, now sit beneath, because the assumption from Ofsted is not many schools will have these 2. They're almost like, they're not actually an appendix to this, but it's almost as if they're the appendix at the bottom of each of the toolkit sections, because Ofsted assume they won't apply to many schools. Exceptional is, as they say, the exception. And hopefully not many schools will need urgent improvement, but they're there if needed, but that's why they sit beneath now. The other thing that has changed since the draft toolkits were published, in the draft toolkit, every section had inclusion within it. And there was this section exclusively on inclusion, so that it doubled up. And actually they've seen sense, and the major union said about that, hang on a minute, why have you got both? So inclusion, it's alluded to and mentioned in some of the other toolkits, but there isn't a section on inclusion for curriculum and inclusion for achievement and leadership, etc. You've just got this one heading here, or one toolkit, sorry. So all the toolkits follow that pattern, apart from safeguarding, which we'll look at later. And this is what Ofsted are saying the report cards will look like now. They've modified them somewhat from the draft ones. So this will be on eventually a one-stop shop portal where a parent, carer can find out about education and care and wraparound care and higher education and further education, etc., from birth to 25 in one place. They find primary school, example primary school in School Lane, and they will see when this school is inspected, Often they've obviously got a time machine here because they've gone back in time and used the proposed inspection framework. And they will see the dots on there for certain areas. So they've got 2 that are strong, 4 that are expected, 1 that needs attention. And then just a summary, safeguarding is met or not met. And they would be able to click on that little drop-down menu underneath to find out, and there will be a paragraph there about safeguarding, just saying that all statutory safeguarding measures are in place, and school meets all statutory stuff. And then if there's anything particular about safeguarding, they might mention that as well, but it's a met or not met judgment there. And then they'll be able to see what does strong standard mean, and it will give a summary of what that means. And then it tells a parent who looks at this, it's curriculum and early years that are strong, and it's attendance and behaviour that need attention. And on the right-hand side, they can click on the drop-down menu and then they get the text. And the text looks very much like we've seen in previous inspections. So there's the text, example text for curriculum and teaching, 3 short paragraphs, trying to capture everything about a school. So they've chopped up the old paper copy and put it into little drop-down menus. So this is what it's actually going to look like now.